I have got my cup of coffee here. I've got a co-thinking partner with my upcoming guest, and I am delighted to be here with all of my Underdog podcast listeners. Thank you, first of all, for all of you for tuning in, for subscribing. It means the world to me. And when I get feedback or thoughts from my listeners, it really does make my day. So thank you for being here. And man, do I have a treat for you today. You're going to meet Dr. Patton McDowell, who does work very similar to mine, but in the United States, in the state of North Carolina. You'll meet him in a second. But I will tell you that I was on Patton's podcast about 2 months ago, Patton?
That's
I think it was
right.
about like,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. And we had such a good conversation that we thought we'd bring it here and expand a little bit. So without further ado, Patton, can you introduce yourself to our Underdog Leadership listeners?
Honored to be here, Jenny. Thank you for letting me continue the conversation. And to your listeners, grateful for the chance to talk about things I think we all share.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I do want to encourage them to check. You were a wonderful guest on Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, episode number 269, to be exact. So for your listeners to get to see you in a different setting, I hope they will.
Yeah.
But I've been in the nonprofit sector almost 35 years. I was fortunate to be an intern at Special Olympics International. Many of your listeners are likely familiar with that organization, as it is truly around the world. And so I was lucky. I got to intern with Eunice Kennedy Shriver, speaking about a female powerhouse leader in this sector. I was lucky. She was still there, still active, and that gave me a glimpse of what nonprofit leadership might look like. Because I was there, Jenny, just like, all right, this is fun to be in
Yeah.
DC, and like,
Yeah.
then I'll get a quote real job. And I was like, wow, this is a real job.
Yeah.
And so I have been in the sector ever since, spent 10 years in Special Olympics, another 10 years in higher education as a chief fundraiser for 2 universities. And then I have been consulting in this space for about 15 years now.
Wow. And it's a family affair, correct?
Indeed. Among my colleagues are a son and a daughter. I have 2 daughters, speaking of women
Yeah.
leaders that
Yeah.
you are such a champion for. But I'm
Yeah.
fortunate my daughter Lauren actually engineers our podcast, that does our social media. And so it's fun to see her generation. And I know
Mm-hmm.
you like that as
Mm-hmm.
well. How do we help talented leaders coming into our sector excel?
Yeah. Oh, can't wait to dive in. Okay, so um, let's start with. I'm actually going to throw a curveball to you now. Just to be clear for our listeners, we have a theme for today, but Patton has no preset questions. We are truly riffing because I think that's where we get the most honest conversations, don't you?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to talk slowly so you have time to process this question. Um, the not-for-profit sector is changing. I'm feeling it. I'm seeing the influences. I'm going to ask you about trends or themes that you're seeing. I'll start so you can do a little bit of thinking.
Sure.
One thing I'm finding is that we're being finally a little bit more creative when it comes to financing models. Those sort of traditional paradigms of philanthropy are breaking down slowly, and maybe not quick enough for some of our community, but and we're seeing different kinds of revenue streams and revenue models. That's my trend. Patton, what do you see as themes or changes in the sector right now?
Restructuring of the staffing models. Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, says that 9-to-5 jobs as we know them will be gone in 10 years. Provocative headline, maybe dramatic, but I do think that will impact our sector, Jenny, that, you know, for leaders out there and aspiring leaders, it's not going to be the same org chart that we grew up in, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be increasing contract workers, mergers and collaborations amongst nonprofit organizations. So I think the leaders that aspires to even more senior leadership is going to have to stay ahead of those, what I would call HR trends. You're not going to be in the same job for 30 years like our parents' generation. And so you've got to be nimble and build your skill set so that you can thrive.
Yeah, it makes me think about the fractional fundraising movement, right?
It's
Um,
growing. Yes,
yeah, it's common, and the sort of respect for contracting as opposed to the old days where getting a job and having a pension was like the number one goal, right?
exactly right.
Yeah,
Exactly
and
right. We all may be doing some form of contract work, and maybe as a means to help supplement income. That
Indeed.
in the next 10 years, you may be working for one organization, but doing contract work for two others.
Yeah, yeah. Not to get political, because that's not my point here, but one of the things I've been watching is the contrast between the reception of Hillary Clinton in 2016 and the reception of Kamala Harris. And one thing as a woman, because I want to transition into the women's piece here for leadership, is the understanding that Kamala Harris can bring more of herself. She can talk about cookies and grandkids and family, as opposed to Hillary, who really was kind of pigeonholed into reminding everyone that she could lead, in Jenny
Right.
Mitchell speak.
Yep.
Tell me what you've seen in trends of women's leadership as far as how they lead and how they're embracing their full personalities in leadership.
Yeah, I'm glad to see there's more opportunity for women leaders to be able to share themselves. And I talk to many of them, learning from them, frankly, how they can define themselves in different ways and communicate. Because I think increasingly, uh, as a leader, you got to attract talent. And I think there is an authenticity to
Yeah.
sharing your whole self. And I hope that women leaders don't feel the pressure that I've got to be perfect, because no wonder we got a mental health crisis for men and women, right? And I hope our sector will lead the way, because many in our sector are serving those with mental health challenges, and so we've got to model it. Right? Are you a leader that is willing to take time off and not send emails at midnight and create this, like, I guess, proving yourself, perhaps, that, and I guess, Jenny, that's what you're saying, right? That maybe we don't have to prove ourselves quite so much.
Yeah. Oh, you've hit two of my favorite themes, right? Attracting talent and perfectionism.
Indeed.
I'm like, where do I go? This is like a kid in a candy store. Okay, hold on, let me focus. So, attracting talent, and your comment about creating a space where people thrive. I love that. I've been on Haley Cooper's podcast talking about psychological safety. We did a LinkedIn Live together.
Nice.
That's been like a theme that's emerging from our world, and this idea that you don't have to overdo in order to excel. We won't talk about where that came from, but I do think it's on the leader to self-manage those experiences. In other words, I used the word last night, self-regulate. In other words, when you see yourself about to send the email at night,
Yep.
and if it's just a matter of efficiency for yourself, putting it on delay send, right? So that it
Send
goes out
later.
in the morning. Yeah.
Right.
And the what happens when you overdo the role, if that's the language we're going to talk about. In my book, I talk about embodied roles. We kind of embody the experience of it. You
Right.
take on the role of the constituent group, and so you can't ever let it go. And it results in this brittle kind of leadership, this sort of "you guys aren't helping me enough" kind of a subtext. Have you seen that? Does that sound
Indeed.
familiar?
It does. And I'm just glad you're lifting up this issue so that the pressure is relieved. I think, well, I've often said, Jenny, that it's important, I think, to own your digital real estate and be willing to communicate. If someone's going to come work for you, they're going to study you. They're going to see what you're posting on LinkedIn. They're going to
Yeah.
see where you have articulated your philosophy of leadership, your philosophy of task management, even.
Mm.
And so I hope I'm seeing increasing, I guess, in this same space, the willingness for organizations in the nonprofit sector to allow sabbaticals. Speaking of the ultimate opportunity, maybe to unplug. I don't know that, at least in my experience, 10 years ago, that was talked about much. Now it is. So maybe are you seeing similar trends but that gets to the board of directors saying, yep,
That's right.
we
Yeah.
understand the organization benefits ultimately from that type of opportunity.
Well, Google does it, and all the big tech companies do it. I had a university client who took the month of July off and 4 weeks unplugged. There's a lot of change in their leadership, and I thought it was a really brave move of her to say, "Look, I need some time to recharge if I want to come back in September and be ready." I do think it's changing, but it's slow, Patton. I think because the work still needs to get done, which is different than Google, right?
So true. And I had a guest, and you'll appreciate this, Habitat for Humanity. Laura Belcher is her name. Huge habitat organization here in the Carolinas. But she suggested that it also strengthened her team. And again, something you and I've talked about, how do
Yeah.
we help the aspiring level,
Yeah. Yeah.
move into senior leadership? So not only was it a gift to her to come
Right.
back stronger, but it forced her team to step up. And so again, I wouldn't look at sabbaticals as, oh, that's just a gift for the executive. No, that
Right.
might be a gift for everybody.
Oh, I love that. That is so true. And you're right. When your CEO steps out and somebody takes on portfolios, stretches themselves, gets
Right.
an opportunity, decides what they like, what they don't like, Patton, that's a great point. And thank you for bringing in the positive spin on that, right? Because it's so easy to get caught up in the work, because
Indeed.
we're so self-important, aren't we?
Indeed. It's not all about us. That's right.
So let's talk about, I know you run mastermind programs. Tell us what the common theme is of people coming in who are sort of self-identifying as the number twos and want to become number ones. What kind of language are they using when they talk to you?
Isolation, sadly, is a topic we talk a lot about, especially in the COVID era, where we were all forced to be more isolated. And as wonderful and efficient sometimes as a hybrid work environment is,
Yeah,
perhaps it limits the opportunity for interaction. So that is among the greatest benefits I've found.
yeah.
Putting good people together, good things happen, and
Mhm.
they find they have a safe space. And so I hope that in fact is a theme I encourage aspiring leader. Create your own mastermind. Man, I'm running
Yes.
one. I've loved it. We've done it for 4 years. We've had 20 different cohorts go through all over the country. And by the way, I'm looking for my first Canadian member. We can do this virtually.
Very
So Jenny,
cool. That's, I love it. I love
but
it.
we've
Yeah.
gotten all over the US, but the principle applies. And again, what I would say to your listeners is creating a space. The concept was started, Napoleon Hill kind of coined the phrase back in the 30s, but it's simply surrounding yourself with like-minded, motivated leaders, and good things will happen. And that's really what I'm encouraging folks
Yeah.
to consider.
Yeah. What I find is too is there's these unanticipated benefits of the mastermind model. So just to, for our listeners, if you've never heard that phrase, my mastermind is called the Penthouse. It's this idea that you bring a group of cohort or you curate a group of women together to support and amplify each other.
Nice.
One of the sidebars that's happened is people realize that not only receiving suggestions and ideas and support, but the opportunity to give advice and provide counsel helps them realize how much they actually know. Just to talk about that,
So good.
yeah, breaking up of perfection, right?
I've I've used the phrase, Jenny, just coach and be coached. That's kind of one of my opening statements, and sounds like that's a principle of yours too. That
Yeah.
there's power in both sides of that equation, having to help
Yes.
someone else, but then being willing to be helped yourself.
Well, isn't that the tenet of all great coaching, right? Is that people come to you already whole. And we are not in the fixing business, right, Patton? We are in the
Right.
business of amplifying and supporting. Sometimes I call myself a thinking partner. Sometimes I call myself a challenger, cheerleader, it depends on the day. And
Well
really,
put.
being able to be that mirror to show somebody the things that they might not see for themselves. We are very hard at seeing our own blind spots. You
So
know,
well put. Yes.
yeah,
And a
yeah,
willingness to frankly self-reflect. That's the other thing that it
yeah,
sounds like you're encouraging as well. That I
yeah,
don't think often very busy nonprofit leaders simply allow the time to stop and reflect.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something I hope for our leader friends to have more time to do.
Wow. Yeah. Reflection. What's that? There's a quote says, if you're not reflecting, you're just going over the motions at the same time and expecting a
Right,
different outcome. Right.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And I
Sidebar. Yeah. Sidebar. I do my reflection mostly in the morning in a special chair that I have named the thinking chair. That has the
love that.
best light.
Love
Okay, it
that.
has the best light because
Yeah.
I can't see anything anymore. And I always have. Sometimes I just sit down and I pick a book randomly. Like I have a coaching book, I have a sort of a new thought leadership book, or I have my journal, and I literally just sit down and say, "What do I feel like today?" Isn't that an interesting? That's
I
what it
love
works
it.
for me.
I know you and I have lots of similarities in style,
Yeah.
but I've become a fan of journaling in the last 10 years. You're right. For me, it's also the morning. And so I've just found
Yeah.
that incredibly therapeutic and creativity
Mhm.
building. Sometimes I'll do one of two exercises. Always good, I think, to do gratitude. So if I'm
Yeah.
stressed, I'll just say I'm going to force myself. What are three things I'm grateful
Yeah.
for? Right,
Yeah.
getting the creative juices flowing, but also just saying, uh, what are 10 ideas on and
Mm.
fill in the blank topic. But like you, I have a chair at home. I also am a fan of coffee shop. I don't know. There's something about
Yeah.
getting into this kind of
Yep.
space, forcing you to concentrate. But couldn't agree more.
Yeah, it's funny when I go to a coffee shop, and I do a lot. I try and focus on one thing. So I will leave all the. So I'm a 7 enthusiastic visionary, right? So I have
Right.
millions of ideas, right? So I
Exactly.
will I will leave all the other things behind. Like I'll leave my agenda. I'll just bring the one thing because it's
Smart.
almost like the distractions. I heard a creative marketer one time tell me that he had a computer that had no internet on purpose because he would bring it to the coffee shop.
Right. So no distraction, right? Literally.
Exactly.
Smart.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's dive into more of these. I'd love for you, as a gentleman who amplifies women's voices, what do you see as some of the habits that hold women back from leadership? It could be in the job application process, it could just be in their presence in the boardroom. Maybe one or two things, Patton.
Yeah. Amplifying their voice again. And I know you share this, and I see this in my own daughters. There's talent, there's opportunity, but perhaps a reticence to share it.
Yeah.
And again, I'm guilty. Sometimes we men have privilege. I know we have privilege that we could just assume we can do it. And we are more, perhaps we speak up more quickly.
Hmm.
But I suggest, and because you and I both know, the majority of nonprofit professionals are female. I hope the trend moves to more leaders in the sector. Again, it's disproportionate. We got more women in the sector, but yet more men still serving the executive roles, and that's not fair. And so we need to make sure we equip these women. But again, I don't mean to oversimplify it as a confidence issue, but sometimes maybe it is. And
Yeah.
I hope I'm like, yeah, you have something good to say. And so
Yeah.
one of my kind of coaching points is let's talk about how you can articulate your voice. You need to write more, you need to speak more, you need to
Yeah.
present more, put yourself out there. But I don't know, Jenny, what do you think? Is that maybe an oversimplified path to
No,
opportunity?
I write, speak, present.
Correct.
I am always surprised when I invite people to come join me on a LinkedIn Live or on a podcast, how many women say, "Oh, well, I've never done that before. I'd have to prepare for it." And I say, absolutely prepare for it. But it does get easier. So practice makes competence, Patton.
So well put.
But
The
you've got to,
repetitions.
yeah, but you've got to put yourself out there. I think the word we're looking for is get uncomfortable. And I don't know why it's easier for men to be uncomfortable than for women,
It's a good question.
but it is a thing, right? There's a social aspect. I'm not saying it's only on women as personalities. I do
Right.
think they're conditioned that way. And that sort of, if you're going to put your foot out, you must be perfect. And don't you dare fall down because everyone's going to look at you. But I love the way you said, and this goes for women or men in the room. Oh, Susan, do you have something to say? You had a great idea on this last week. What was it you were saying?
Collaborative nature, and you're right, we can help each other in that sense.
Yeah,
I hope for many of our listeners that they have opportunities or someone in the room that will collaborate, but sometimes they don't, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so you've got to be willing to say, hey, I have something to say and I'm going to say it with confidence.
Bold. That's my
Yeah.
word.
Right.
Sometimes my clients will put bold. I invite them to put it on a sticky note, right, and bring it with them to the meeting. The other thing I had one time,
Good
I hope I'm
idea.
not, yeah, I hope I'm not telling any stories out of church, but one gal that I was coaching had this real dork on the committee. We're all in committee work, right? And so she wrote herself a post-it note that said, "So and so is a dork. He has nothing useful to say. Don't let him get to
Don't
you."
let them get in your head. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. because he was undermining her experience of that committee, and it was affecting her ability to lead. And I just admired the way she took ownership of it. That this is an extreme case, Patton. Let me be
Yeah,
clear.
sure,
As coaches,
sure.
we don't use that kind of language. We ask, how is that person feeling, right? Rather than
Right.
why is that person so annoying? But I love the way that she decided she was going to own her presence in that meeting and say, he's not going to get to me. And you have to set that intention, don't you? Because they get under your skin, they trigger you with behaviors that are familiar to you, that set you off, and then you lose your personal power.
Mrs. Shriver, again, I have to give her credit for so many of my leadership lessons, but
Yeah.
she was a real advocate for being a good meeting presenter. In other words, there's some of our listeners might say, well, yeah, I don't have a chance to get behind the podium and speak to a group. I'm like, all right, but you probably have an opportunity within the next staff meeting or maybe at
Yeah.
the board meeting. And she was really adamant. She didn't suffer fools. You don't ramble. And so
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes.
practice. Oh, I saw her cut down. I was terrified. but what she taught was you speak in some ways like you write a succinct and effective paragraph.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah.
Mrs. Shriver. There are 3 reasons we should invest in North Carolina Special Olympics. 1, 2, 3. Boom. And that I thought you could prepare for that. And so I'm hoping maybe your listeners think about it, because you see it often, don't we? Our colleagues that ramble on and on and on, and maybe it's the dork you described that
Yeah.
everybody's tired of. All right, well, let's be the opposite of that
Yeah.
and practice these opportunities where we can speak.
So I love this communication and how you prepare for conversations. My experience is as a Pisces, so I see both sides of everything,
Yeah,
right?
good.
So
We
I'm
need that.
with empathy. The challenge is I'm always playing devil's advocate for myself, and it can be
Right.
exhausting living in my head. Just no sidebar. What I have learned in leadership is I don't need to bring to the table all my ruminations. I really try hard to, what's the word, self-edit
Yeah,
and
right.
select my best arguments. And you'll notice even in the podcast, sometimes I slow down my voice a little bit just to be a little bit more clearly understood. And so we present in a way that breeds confidence and competence, and we highlight the most important arguments first. We have the other ones in our back pocket, right? Doesn't mean we didn't think of X, Y, and Z. And we prepare a little bit for what might happen. In my earlier days, I would say I over prepared. I just want to own that I spent obsessive amounts of time
Yeah,
worrying.
right.
I don't do that anymore. I really focus on where my feet are. That's one of my phrases when I walk into a meeting. I'm here with you, Patton. I am where my feet are.
Love that.
I love that. And I practice it every day because, there's a whole other litany of stuff that's going to go on today at Chavador and etc. But right now I'm enjoying this
Right.
and working hard to be succinct. I think that's one part of it. Also, remind yourself you're allowed to bring people along. You can own your space in a quiet way that isn't in a noisy way. I think women push away from this idea of owning all the space, sort of grandstanding, but realize that you can have influence in another method.
Love that. Mrs. Shriver, would love your approach.
Yeah.
And again, I would highlight 2 things. One, the self-awareness that you are modeling, but you're not being paralyzed by it either, right? And to your
Well played.
earlier point, we don't want our analysis to keep us from speaking up at all. And so you can be organized, you can be confident, and you can practice.
Yeah. One of the best briefing notes I got, and I was a board chair at the time, was from someone who had worked in one of the government agencies here in Canada. And he did a little bit of a one-pager. Love those one-pagers, Patton. Yeah. Love them. It was just context setting and then 2 discussion questions for the board. Brilliant. Brilliant. Because often we bring things forward that people don't have enough context or backstory for. Hopefully you have a board that reads things, hopefully. And so that you can have a fruitful, strategic discussion. I love the questions because they're a bit of a guidepost, Patton. Not just like, what do you think? Point. Which drives me bonkers.
Yeah, where do you go with that? Right.
Where do you go? But I just throw that in. Let's move into, that might be a nice way to go into board leadership and whether we're talking about women on boards or we're talking about CEOs managing up to boards. There is a nuance to that board leadership space, isn't there?
Yes. You just hit, though, a critical point. And you would think you and I did prepare these questions together. We didn't,
We
but
did it.
I found a skill that perhaps executive directors can benefit from. I do think you have to be able to communicate in an executive memo style. I had a board chair famously tell me, if you can't write it within one page, I'm not reading it. This guy was the head of Bank of America, Hugh McCall by name. So,
Yeah.
he,
Yeah.
but I think he represents a lot of maybe, good and bad of board leaders who won't take the time. So as a leader, I think that's a communication skill, right? To be able to put something succinct manner so that
Yeah.
your board can translate. I love your idea of kind of putting questions to them so it's more active and not just, you're asking me to read a report that I may or may not do.
I think you're so right about the briefing. So here's the dichotomy I see is you either, as a leader, many people are so frustrated with their boards. And I want to honor that it's not easy work. It's like having nine bosses, all
Very
that good
true.
stuff that we've had before. We've talked about it's challenging. They don't work in consensus. Some of them are very immature in their leadership, blah, blah, blah. But, and this is where the but and the and come in.
Still have to work with them, though, right? Yeah.
You still have to work with them, and you have to find a way that optimizes both your strengths and their strengths. So again, that judger versus learner, rather than being frustrated with how they don't support you, I hear a lot of that. I flip that question and say, where can I make a change? How can I adapt the way the pieces that I have control over, which most of the time is an executive director's report or finance or whatever, or agendas, Patton, we can always get stuff on agendas.
Indeed.
Right? And really kind of own that part so that we can get out of our boards what we need. And let's just accept the fact this is a long play. This is a 6 to 8 month play. It may take you, drip it into the conversation, drip it into the conversation. And they're not going to bite the first 3 times, Patton. You know what I'm saying?
So true. And let me echo what you're saying. I see it as well. The complaints I hear often are either my board is disengaged or they're micromanaging me, neither of which is good. And so, like you're hearing, I hear the same thing. I don't know what to do. It's frustrating. I've got important things to do, but I like that you kind of suggest the timeline is a long play. I think there are 2 ways. One, I find a lot of organizations don't have a clearly defined job description for their board. And so in the defense of the board members, they're bringing baggage and or previous experiences, and maybe they think that's the way it should be. So using the kind of collective discussion around, let's talk about what being a best practice board is for this organization. And then 2, to your 6 to 9 month timeline, I think you have to have the one-on-one relationship. Literally, and knowing you, I bet you would bring key questions. When I sit down with each board member, how do you want to be engaged? How do we maximize your time, talent, and skills to benefit this organization? And that gives you a little bit of play. Well, thank you, but I don't need that, right? But I could definitely use whatever else is there. But I would hope that maybe over the course of a year, you could transform the board relationship.
I love that. And people act very differently one-on-one than they do in groupthink.
Exactly right. Exactly.
The groupthink is always going to be conservative, risk averse, and a little bit more cautious, I find. And when you can isolate them, that's probably the wrong word, isolate, but you know what I mean? Like talk to them, get to know them.
Right.
Yes. And remember, trust is consistency over time. So building trust, the relationship is the conversation. You've got to find a way to relate. The other theme I see is CEOs, particularly women, I will say, bending over backwards for their board. So not healthy boundaries, taking phone calls in the middle of the day. Like board members shouldn't be able to access you all the time, just to be clear. Like you set up the dynamic, the power dynamic that way, and they're going to be confused when they can't reach you. And if this is inhibiting you from doing the good work that you need to do, there are absolutely ways you can be proactive about that, whether it's setting a set time, asking for, just create a list of ideas or agenda items. Board members that are new, they love to come up with ideas. Asking them to prioritize them, put them on a piece of paper before you get there. Because what I find is it's the little... it's the shiny object syndrome, right? We should run a lottery. We should run a lottery. We should run a lottery. And then next week, there's like not a mention of the lottery and you've done all this work, right?
Speaking of distractions you don't need.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what else do you see as far as board behaviors and board leader and CEO leadership that we want to highlight for our listeners? Because I think this is like, if there's one pain point, this is it, I think.
Yeah, well, you said it earlier too, having better meetings. Again, I think sometimes we as staff on the nonprofit side contribute to meetings that are not engaging. And so we wonder why board members are looking for their own distraction because they're bored, literally, BORED instead of being BOARD. And so I think there's a wordplay there that should be
Yeah.
considered. But are you doing the consent agenda and getting some
Mm-hmm.
of the administration out of the way? Are you allowing for strategic discussion at every meeting?
Mm-hmm.
I've sat through meetings, and I bet every listener has too, and they're painful. And so, are we contributing to a structure that doesn't allow the board and staff to be at their best? And then we wonder why board members are trying to do end arounds and other ways of creating confusion, but they're busy. They're not going to come sit for 2 hours and listen to the staff report for 90% of it. I say, Jenny, do an agenda audit, and I think it'll be eye-opening for you as staff. Audit the agendas of all your board meetings last year. See what percentage of the agenda allows for good
Mm-hmm.
engagement. And I've
Mm-hmm.
had people come back and say, yeah, you're right, Patton. 90% of it was us talking to them. No wonder they're, jumping out of their skin.
Yeah. One of my pet peeves is the copy and paste agenda too. Last month's agenda, we just copy and paste forward.
Guilty. I've been guilty. You're right.
Yeah. And it's a quick fix, right? It's when you're busy. But I think, not every committee needs to talk every time. You need to figure out, I love taking half of a board meeting and talking about something strategic and having some kind of an arc to the
Beautiful.
year. Yeah.
Right.
I've
Right.
also seen this one really, I love this one. We had a foundation board that met every 2 months, and they focused half their time on some kind of content around learning in fund development. So they would have a guest come in, talk about legacy. They would have a fellow CEO from another hospital talk about their lottery.
I love that.
Brilliant. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and again, just makes that's the kind of meeting I want to go to,
I
right? If
know.
I'm a board
Yeah.
member,
Yeah.
and I like the fact you're utilizing external sometimes influences to help
Yeah.
build conversation.
Well, I always talk about show, don't tell.
Right.
Nobody likes to be told. Nobody likes to be told that they're bad at their job role either, by the way, right? But if you show them an alternative, or you bring them away, or you let an expert who they respect, or the local chapter that's had the most amazing capital campaign, bring them in and ask them to speak about their experience, rather than this sort of how will we raise the money circular conversation that happens,
So
right?
true. We can learn from them. And then you're right. It's not an accusatory, what are we doing wrong here? Hey, let's rally around how we can be the best board possible. And
Yeah.
I've brought, as you just said, the executive director of an organization that we aspire to be like. And we can ask her, all right, how did you work through some of these challenges, right? What do you find is the most meaningful way you are able to achieve your program? And then your board, you don't have to tell your board that.
Yeah.
They'll pick it up
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. I'm seeing this 3D landscape photo for board meetings. So you've got foreground, background, you've got texture, pattern. So really kind of crafting it as an experience is what of course, I'm an enthusiastic visionary. I'm a 7, right? So I get bored really fast. So I'm like, is this just me? I'm not
You're who we're
saying
talking to, right? Yes.
I know, exactly, right? And let's be honest, our fund development board members, our best board members for fund development, are going to be business owners who want to hire the short, like you said, the short details, make a decision and move forward. They often sit on the fund development committee, not actually even on the board, right?
Right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
But
And
you mentioned something that how many times when we do a board orientation do we identify aspirational organizations? In other words, usually we just hit them with, hey, I need you to fundraise when you join the board. And they're like immediately, I think, kind of a little bit defensive, like, all right,
yeah,
well, I'm not totally confident about that.
yeah,
But like you said, let's just show them.
yeah,
These are the best 2 organizations in our sector in all of Canada. All right. And as a board member, I'd like you to get to know them. Here's their website.
yeah,
And then, like you said, maybe we create some peer to peer,
yeah,
arrangements,
yeah.
communications, and then your board member then runs with it themselves instead of you feeling like you got to kind of pull them behind you.
Ugh, love that. My colleague Sherry Schaefer runs all the mentorship programs through Shavender, and she does a lot of the succession planning. And we've been talking a lot about mentorship and buddy systems inside boards, so that we
Nice.
don't lose the legacy piece, right?
Right.
Every 3 years, the whole corporate knowledge walks off the board, and finding ways to build I've been calling sisterhood sistering between, the way you put two joists together and they're
Yeah.
sistered
Right.
together to hold the
Right.
load.
Right.
And it can be informal, but if a board member has a question at a meeting, a new board member, it doesn't necessarily have to be the ED or whatever who follows up. It can, the older board members can take responsibility for that. So I've been playing with mentorship, and I agree. Our onboarding, if you're having trouble with your board, you almost always have to go back to the root.
Starts
How are
there.
they? Yeah.
Starts there. You're
Yeah.
right.
And you don't have to invent the wheel, but you sure as heck got to have a PowerPoint that describes all the pieces and how everybody works. And I know it's boring. It's even boring for me, but it's got to have, if you set it up in a way that it can be presented, or it's a document. I find people are better with an in-person meeting than here's your handbook. I don't know. Have you found that too?
Completely agree. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just not engaging. They'll look at it while they're there. It'll go on the shelf. They'll never read it again. So
Yeah.
how do we activate, their resource material you can send them home with, but activate it during that orientation. It'll pay off.
Yeah, love that. So we've hit so many topics. We've hit the talent discussion about attracting talent. We've talked about board relations at the end here. We talked about how to help amplify women's voices. Um, as we kind of close out here, I'm trying to think if there's any other message you want our women leaders out there that are working hard, being ambitious, holding on to their compassion, wanting to hold on to their kindness as a core value. What do you want to say to them?
Build community. Jenny, you're such a good proponent of this. Join a mastermind. Join your mastermind. Find that there is a community support you. I suggest in my book, I explore this concept. Form your own personal board of directors. And I think in the nonprofit space, there's opportunity. Get outside of your own community, though. Broaden your kind of connections there. I encourage people I'm working with to identify two people that are comparable peers, people that understand they're in the same kind of job you are, but also identify two aspirational peers. When I was with Special Olympics, I asked around and said, who is the best at doing my job anywhere in the country? And inevitably, it's a subjective analysis, but they're like, oh, yeah, you need to talk to Susan in Colorado. She is the best. And sure enough, if I reach out to Susan respectfully, she was willing to give me some time. And so that's the best thing, too. You said it, that I think there is peer support, but we have to go ask for it. And so I still, to this day, Jenny, try to make connection a couple times a month. And just a simple, and you'll like this too, I have 4 questions. Why'd you get into this work? What was the biggest challenge you faced? What are you most proud of? And what resources are most helpful or were most helpful to you on your journey that might help me? And I really think your listeners can benefit, but you need to be proactive, and hopefully building community is something that you and I both can help many of our colleagues with.
Proactive. That's such an important message. It could be with my girls, it's proactive. Yes, you can go to the dentist by yourself. Right?
Mom, yeah, I don't know if I'm ready for that, but yes, you're
Right?
spot on.
Yeah, yeah, try it. Why don't you go? I remember when they're little, you can go up to the counter and pay for that bubble tea. We have a lot of bubble tea in my house, Patton. Oh my gosh. That's such an important message, and it really speaks to
Yeah,
that whole getting uncomfortable. It might feel really uncomfortable to reach out to the CEO of the local XYZ organization that you admire, but man, very few people will turn down an outreach where they want to learn from you. I'll tell you.
exactly right. If you're respectful and thoughtful and do your homework, right? When I reach out to Susan in Colorado, I'm going to make sure I understand what Colorado Special Olympics is doing so that I can be respectful of the great work she is. And obviously, then I think she's more inclined to reciprocate.
Love that. Love that. Patton, it's been a pleasure. Where can people find out more about you? Tell us about your book. Tell us about your podcast.
Thank you. I'm not creative enough to come up with multiple names. Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership is the title of both. Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership is the podcast. It is also the title of my book, Patton McDowell is my name. Find me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. And my firm is called PMA Nonprofit Leadership. So thank you again, Jenny, for the opportunity to talk about these topics you and I both are passionate about.
I know. And all of my listeners, we're going to hang up and then we're going to talk for another half hour after the podcast because there's like, what about this? And what about that?
There's more to go. That's right.
That's right. But it's been a real pleasure to have you here and to offer your ideas, your advice. One thing I particularly noticed, Patton, is your inquisitiveness. And I don't know if you listeners heard it too, but he often asks open-ended questions and throws the tennis ball back and forth. Is something I talk about. It's a conversation. It's not a monologue. So thank you for that.
Grateful.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So listen, everybody, go be great. Hope you have a wonderful week. Would love to hear from you. Any thoughts that came up from this episode. And if you have not subscribed, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'll tell you what happens when you subscribe. More people get to hear the podcast. More people get to hear about these messages, and we get to change the world faster. Go be great.